Fall River, Massachusetts. November 2008, where the ghosts of Lizzie Borden still whisper through abandoned textile mills, a 34-year-old Portuguese-American mother of two left her Thanksgiving shift at the hospital and drove into a night she'd never escape. Her silver Honda Civic was found 3 days later in the parking lot of Quequechan Mill, a crumbling 19th-century factory where 10,000 workers once stitched America's industrial dreams. The driver's door hung open. Her scrubs sat folded on the passenger seat. Her phone, keys, and wedding ring were gone. For 15 years, Bristol County detectives walked the same streets as her killer, a man who'd sat at Thanksgiving dinners, who'd comforted her sobbing children, who'd worn a cross around his neck every Sunday at St. Anthony's Church. Then in 2023, a confession whispered in a dying woman's hospital room shattered the silence. It was family. It was always family. In a city haunted by America's most famous unsolved family murder, history was about to repeat itself, but this time the monster had a name. The last photograph of Maria Oliveira alive was taken by a security camera at Charlton Memorial Hospital at 10:42 p.m. on November 27, 2008. She stood at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, her navy blue scrubs showing the wear of a double shift. She was smiling at something a colleague had said, her hand resting on a patient chart, completely unaware that in less than 2 hours she would be dead. The timestamp on that footage would become the cornerstone of a timeline that investigators would reconstruct minute by minute, searching for the moment when an ordinary Thanksgiving night turned into something unspeakable. Maria had worked at Charlton Memorial for 11 years, ever since she finished her LPN certification at Bristol Community College. She was the kind of nurse patients remembered, the one who stayed late to hold the hand of a frightened elderly woman, who knew everyone's grandchildren's names, who brought homemade Portuguese sweetbread to share during night shifts. Her co-workers described her as tireless, devoted, the kind of person who picked up extra holiday shifts so others could be with their families. That Thanksgiving, she'd volunteered to cover for a colleague with young children, even though it meant missing her own family dinner at her in-laws' house on Globe Street. The hospital security footage showed her leaving through the employee entrance at 11:03 p.m., pulling her winter coat tight against the November cold. She waved to a security guard named Dennis Costa, who would later tell investigators that she seemed tired but cheerful, that she'd mentioned wanting to get home to check on her sons before they went to bed. Her silver Honda Civic, a 2004 model with a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror and a faded bumper sticker that read "Proud Parent of an Honor Student," was parked in her usual spot in the employee lot. The camera captured her unlocking the door, tossing her work bag onto the passenger seat, and pulling out of the parking lot at 11:07 p.m., her brake lights glowing red as she stopped at the exit before turning left onto Highland Avenue. That was the last confirmed sighting of Maria Oliveira driving her own vehicle. What happened in the next 40 minutes would remain a mystery for 15 years, a gap in time that investigators would fill with theories, witness statements that contradicted each other, and eventually a confession that explained everything while somehow making it all feel worse. The route from Charlton Memorial to Maria's triple-decker apartment on Ferry Street was straightforward, a drive that should have taken 12 minutes even with Thanksgiving traffic. She would have headed south on Highland, merged onto Route 24 for a brief stretch, then exited onto President Avenue before winding through the residential neighborhoods that made up Fall River's south end. But Maria never made it home. Her husband Anthony Oliveira was already asleep when she left work. He'd spent Thanksgiving Day at his brother David's house on Globe Street, a family tradition that stretched back 3 generations to when their grandfather first emigrated from the Azores and bought the property with money saved from working the textile mills. Anthony had assumed Maria would come straight to David's after her shift ended, but when she called around 6 p.m. to say she was too exhausted and would just head home after work, he'd understood. She'd been working double shifts for 3 weeks straight, trying to save extra money for Christmas presents and the boys' spring soccer fees. He woke up at 7:15 a.m. on November 28, reached across the bed, and felt only cold sheets. His first thought wasn't alarm, it was annoyance. She must have pulled another double shift without telling him, he thought, probably covering for someone else again. But when he walked into the kitchen and saw that the coffee maker hadn't been used, that her purse wasn't on its usual hook by the door, that her coat wasn't hanging on the rack, the annoyance shifted into something colder. He called her cell phone, it rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. He called the hospital. They told him she'd clocked out at 10:58 p.m., right on schedule. Anthony Oliveira called the Fall River Police Department at 8:47 a.m. to report his wife missing. The dispatcher, a woman named Patricia Souza, who'd gone to high school with Maria, took the report with growing concern in her voice. It wasn't like Maria to disappear. It wasn't like her to not call. Patricia flagged the report as priority and sent it directly to the Detective Bureau, bypassing the usual 24-hour waiting period that missing adult cases typically required. Something about this felt wrong from the start. Detective Thomas Santos caught the case at 9:15 a.m. He was 53 years old, a 30-year veteran of the Fall River Police Department, and he'd worked enough missing persons cases to know that the first few hours were critical. He drove to the Oliveira apartment on Ferry Street, a narrow triple-decker with peeling paint and a small concrete stoop where someone had placed a ceramic Virgin Mary statue surrounded by fake flowers. Anthony met him at the door, his face pale, his hands shaking. The 2 boys, Michael and Lucas, ages 12 and 9, sat on the couch in the living room watching cartoons with the volume turned too loud, a coping mechanism their father had deployed to keep them from hearing the conversation. Santos asked the routine questions. Had they argued recently? No. Was she depressed, anxious, showing any signs of wanting to leave? Absolutely not. Did she have friends she might have gone to stay with? No one she wouldn't have called first. Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her? Anthony's face twisted at the question. Maria didn't have enemies, he said. Everyone loved her. She worked at the hospital. She went to church. She came home to her family. That was her life. Santos wrote it all down in his notebook, but he was already thinking about the statistics, about the fact that in missing persons cases involving married women, the husband was the first person you looked at, whether you wanted to or not. The search for Maria's Honda began immediately. Santos put out a bolo, "Be on the lookout," to every patrol unit in Bristol County, describing the vehicle and the license plate number. By noon, tips were coming in. Someone thought they'd seen a silver Honda near the Braga Bridge. Another caller reported a similar car parked outside a convenience store in Somerset. Each lead sent officers racing across the city, only to find the wrong vehicle or nothing at all. The frustration was mounting, and Santos felt the familiar weight of a case that was slipping away from him in real time. The breakthrough came at 2:35 p.m., when a Fall River patrol officer named James Medeiros radioed in from the Quequechan Mill parking lot. He'd found a silver 2004 Honda Civic, matching the bolo description, parked at an angle near the southeast corner of the lot, partially hidden behind an overgrown hedge. The driver's door was open, the keys were gone, the interior looked staged, almost theatrical in its wrongness. Maria's scrubs were folded neatly on the passenger seat, not tossed casually like someone changing clothes in a hurry, but folded with hospital corners, with precision. Her work bag was missing, her cell phone was gone, and on the dashboard, arranged in a way that made Medeiros' stomach turn, were 3 items: her wedding ring, her watch, and a single earring, just one. The other was nowhere to be found. Santos arrived at the scene within minutes, bringing with him a team from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Scene Services section. The Quequechan Mill loomed over them, 6 stories of decay and broken windows, a monument to Fall River's industrial past that now served mostly as a backdrop for urban explorers and teenagers looking for a place to drink. The mill had been abandoned since the early 1980s, when the last textile company to operate there went bankrupt and left behind machines, fabric bolts, and the ghosts of 10,000 workers who'd spent their lives inside those walls. The parking lot was pitted with potholes and overgrown with weeds, a place people drove past but never stopped. Why would Maria come here? Santos walked around the Honda, careful not to touch anything, studying the scene like a text he needed to translate. The driver's door hung open at a 45-degree angle, as if someone had exited quickly or been pulled out. There were no visible signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no torn fabric, no indication that Maria had fought. But the arrangement of her belongings bothered him. The folded scrubs, the jewelry lined up on the dashboard, it felt deliberate, staged like someone was sending a message or trying to mislead investigators. Serial killers sometimes stage scenes to confuse police or to fulfill some psychological need, but this didn't feel like that. This felt personal. The crime scene services team spent 4 hours processing the Honda. They dusted for fingerprints, finding dozens that would later be identified as belonging to Maria, her husband, her children, and several friends who'd ridden in the car over the months. They swabbed for DNA, collecting samples from the steering wheel, the door handles, the gear shift. They photographed every inch of the interior from multiple angles, documenting the precise placement of every item. They found a receipt from a gas station, dated November 26, a grocery list in Maria's handwriting, and a stack of her son's school papers in the back seat. Everything pointed to a normal life interrupted. What they didn't find was more telling. No blood, no hair that didn't belong to Maria or her family, no fibers that seemed out of place, no forensic evidence that someone else had been in that car recently. It was as if Maria had simply parked, arranged her belongings with care, and walked away into thin air. But Santos knew that wasn't what happened. The open door, the missing phone and keys, the single earring, it all pointed to something else. Someone had taken her. The question was who, and why here, and where was she now? The search expanded immediately. Fall River Police, Massachusetts State Police, and volunteers from the community fanned out across the area surrounding Quequechan Mill. They searched the building itself, navigating through collapsed floors and rooms filled with decaying machinery, calling Maria's name into the darkness. They searched the woods behind the mill, a dense tangle of bare November trees and underbrush that stretched for acres. They searched vacant lots, abandoned buildings, the banks of the Taunton River that flowed brown and cold through the city. Dogs from the State Police Canine Unit picked up a scent trail from the Honda that led about 50 yards toward the mill entrance, then disappeared completely, as if Maria had been lifted into the air. By nightfall on November 28, the temperature had dropped to 32 degrees. If Maria was out there somewhere, injured or trapped, time was running out. Santos stood in the parking lot as the sun set behind the mill's silhouette, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He'd been a cop long enough to trust his instincts, and every instinct he had was screaming that Maria Oliveira wasn't missing. She was dead. And whoever killed her knew her well enough to know she'd be working that Thanksgiving night, well enough to know her route home, well enough to get her to stop. The media descended on Fall River by the weekend. News vans from Boston stations parked outside the police department and the Oliveira family's apartment. Reporters stood in front of Quequechan Mill doing stand-ups, their breath visible in the cold air as they recounted the basic facts of the case. A Fall River nurse vanishes after her Thanksgiving shift. Her car found abandoned at a historic mill. Police say they're investigating all possibilities. The coverage was respectful at first, focusing on Maria's role as a mother and healthcare worker, showing family photos provided by Anthony that depicted birthday parties and beach trips and ordinary happiness. But as the days passed with no breaks in the case, the tone shifted. Reporters started asking harder questions. Had police cleared the husband? Were there any persons of interest? Was this connected to other unsolved cases in the area? Santos held a press conference on December 2, standing at a podium with Bristol County District Attorney Samuel Sutter beside him. He gave the standard lines about following multiple leads, about encouraging anyone with information to come forward, about the community's cooperation being vital. What he didn't say was that they had nothing. No suspects, no motive, no body. And with each passing day the likelihood of finding Maria alive dropped closer to zero. The break everyone was hoping for came on December 8, 11 days after Maria disappeared. 2 teenage boys cutting through the southeastern Massachusetts Bioreserve, a nature conservation area about 4 miles from Quequechan Mill, stumbled across something in a shallow ravine. At first they thought it was a mannequin, the kind stores throw out when they're damaged. But as they got closer, as the shape resolved into something more specific, more human, they realized what they were looking at. One of the boys called 911, while the other vomited into the dead leaves. The dispatcher could barely understand what he was saying through his gasping breaths, but the words body and woman and woods came through clear enough. Santos arrived at the scene at 3:47 p.m., his stomach already knotted with the certainty of what he'd find. The bioreserve was a sprawling area of protected wetlands and forest, the kind of place where hikers and birdwatchers went during warmer months, but few people ventured in November. The body was approximately 200 yards from the nearest trail, down a slope thick with brush and fallen trees, a location that suggested whoever put her there knew the area well or had scouted it in advance. She was lying on her back, partially covered with dead branches and leaves, her face turned toward the sky. Even before the medical examiner confirmed it, Santos knew it was Maria Oliveira. The scene processing took the rest of that day and into the next. The area was cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape. State police brought in portable lights powered by generators. Forensic technicians worked in the cold, photographing every detail before carefully removing the debris covering the body. Dr. Richard Chen, the deputy chief medical examiner for Massachusetts, arrived from Boston to personally oversee the initial examination at the scene. He was a careful man, methodical, someone who understood that what he found here would determine the direction of the entire investigation. Maria was dressed in the clothes she'd worn under her scrubs, jeans, a sweater, sneakers. Her hospital ID badge was still clipped to her waistband. There were ligature marks around her neck, deep furrows in the skin that indicated strangulation with something thin and strong, possibly a cord or wire. Her face showed petechial hemorrhaging, small burst blood vessels in the eyes and skin that confirmed asphyxiation. There were defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, cuts and bruises that indicated she'd fought. Under her fingernails, forensic technicians found tissue and what appeared to be skin cells, evidence that she'd scratched her attacker. This was the best evidence they had. If they could extract DNA from those samples, they might have their killer. The autopsy was performed the following day at the Massachusetts office of the chief medical examiner in Boston. Santos and Detective Lisa Chen from the state police drove up together, sitting in silence for most of the hour-long trip. Autopsies were never easy, but ones involving victims you'd been searching for, victims whose families you'd promised to bring home safely, those were the hardest. Dr. Chen worked with professional detachment, narrating his findings into a recorder while his assistants took photographs and samples. Cause of death: asphyxiation due to ligature strangulation. Time of death: approximately 10 to 12 hours after she was last seen leaving the hospital, which placed it in the early morning hours of November 28. Evidence of sexual assault: negative. Toxicology: pending but no obvious signs of drugs or alcohol in her system. The DNA recovered from under Maria's fingernails was sent to the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory for analysis. In 2008, DNA technology was already sophisticated, capable of building profiles from minute samples and comparing them against databases like CODIS, the combined DNA index system that contained profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees. But there was a catch: the DNA had to match someone already in the system. If Maria's killer had never been convicted of a crime, never been arrested, never had their DNA collected for any reason, then the sample under her nails was just genetic data, waiting for a comparison that might never come. The results came back 2 weeks later. The DNA profile was clear and complete, a strong sample that showed Maria had definitely scratched someone during her attack. The lab ran it through CODIS. No matches. They expanded the search to include arrestee databases, to include samples from other unsolved cases in Massachusetts and surrounding states. Still nothing. Whoever killed Maria Oliveira had no criminal record, or at least no record that included DNA. This was both frustrating and telling. It suggested someone who'd never been caught, never been suspected, someone who lived a life clean enough to avoid any serious encounter with law enforcement. Santos and his team shifted to traditional detective work. They interviewed Maria's co-workers at Charlton Memorial, asking about any patients who'd seemed fixated on her, any conflicts she'd mentioned, anything unusual in the weeks leading up to her death. Nothing stood out. They interviewed her friends from church, women who'd known her since she'd married into the Oliveira family 15 years earlier. Everyone said the same thing: Maria was devoted to her family, worked hard, kept to herself mostly. No affairs, no gambling debts. No secret life that might explain why someone would want her dead. They looked at Anthony, because that's what you do. Spouses are statistically the most likely suspects in domestic homicides, and Santos had been a cop too long to skip that step just because Anthony seemed genuinely devastated. They examined the couple's finances, looking for insurance policies or debt that might provide motive. They found a modest life insurance policy through Maria's job, $50,000 with Anthony as the beneficiary, but that was standard for hospital employees and hardly worth murdering someone over. They checked Anthony's phone records, his whereabouts on Thanksgiving night. He'd been at his brother David's house on Globe Street until about 11:30 p.m., then driven home and gone to bed. Multiple family members confirmed it. His cell phone records showed no calls or texts after 10 p.m. Security footage from a gas station near his apartment showed his truck passing by at 11:47 p.m., consistent with his statement about when he'd left David's house. They looked at David Reed, Anthony's older brother, because he was the last family member to see Anthony that night. David was 42 years old, a contractor who ran a small construction business with 2 employees. He owned the triple-decker on Globe Street where his family had lived for 3 generations, a point of pride in a city where so much had been lost to economic decline. David was cooperative during questioning, almost overly so, answering every question with detail that seemed rehearsed. He'd been home all Thanksgiving evening, he said, hosting his brother's family and their elderly mother. Anthony had left around 11:30 p.m. David had cleaned up, watched some television, and gone to bed around 1 a.m. His wife, Catherine, confirmed the timeline, so did his teenage daughter. But something bothered Santos about David Reed. It wasn't anything concrete, nothing he could articulate in a report. It was the way David's eyes never quite met his during the interview, the way he seemed more concerned about establishing his alibi than expressing grief over his sister-in-law's murder. The way he asked about the investigation's progress in a tone that sounded less like concern and more like intelligence gathering. Santos made a note in his case file, David Reed follow-up. Something off here. The investigation stalled, without DNA matches, without clear suspects, without witnesses who'd seen anything useful, the case started to go cold. Santos worked it for 6 months, conducting over 200 interviews, executing 15 search warrants, following every lead that came in through the tip line. But by summer 2009, the reality was undeniable. They'd hit a wall. The Bristol County District Attorney's Office kept the case open, but resources were redirected to newer crimes. Santos moved on to other cases, though he kept Maria's file in his desk drawer and thought about it every time he drove past Quequechan Mill. For the Oliveira family, the lack of answers was its own kind of torture. Anthony tried to maintain normalcy for his sons, getting them to school, to soccer practice, to church on Sundays, but the house on Ferry Street felt haunted. Maria's clothes still hung in the closet. Her nursing textbooks still lined a shelf in the living room. The boys started having nightmares. Michael, the older one, became withdrawn and angry. Lucas, the younger, started seeing a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. Anthony, aged 10 years and 1, his hair going gray, his face developing deep lines that hadn't been there before. The Portuguese community in Fall River rallied around the family. St. Anthony's Church held a memorial mass on the first anniversary of Maria's death, the pews packed with people who'd known her, who'd worked with her, who just wanted to show support. Father Manuel Silva, who'd baptized both of Maria's sons, gave a homily about faith in the face of incomprehensible loss. But in the back of the church, sitting in a pew near the exit, David Reed listened with his head bowed and his hands clasped, looking like a man at war with himself. The case remained cold for 15 years. Santos retired in 2019, never having solved the murder that haunted him most. The file passed to younger detectives who gave it periodic reviews but found nothing new. DNA technology advanced significantly during those years, with genetic genealogy solving cases that had been cold for decades. But Bristol County's budget was tight, and paying for genealogy services to reanalyze old evidence was a luxury they couldn't afford unless there was a compelling reason to believe it would work. Then in October 2023, everything changed. St. Anne's Hospital in Fall River received a patient named Catherine Reed, age 68, admitted with stage 4 pancreatic cancer that had metastasized to her liver. She'd waited too long to see a doctor, and by the time she came in there was nothing to do but manage her pain and make her comfortable. Her husband David visited every day, sitting beside her bed and holding her hand. But on the morning of October 17th, Catherine asked the nurses if she could speak to someone privately. She said she had something important to tell someone, but it couldn't be her family. The nurse, a woman named Jennifer Costa who'd worked at St. Anne's for 20 years, recognized something in Catherine's tone. She'd seen enough dying patients to know when someone was carrying a burden they needed to unload. She called the hospital's social worker, who in turn called a priest, thinking Catherine wanted to make confession. But Catherine was clear, she didn't want a priest. She wanted to talk to the police. Detective Angela Ruiz, of the Fall River Police Department, arrived at St. Anne's at 2:30 p.m. She was 34 years old, relatively new to the detective bureau, and she'd never worked a cold case before. When dispatch told her a dying woman wanted to talk about an old crime, she'd expected a deathbed confession to shoplifting or insurance fraud, something minor that had haunted someone's conscience for years. She wasn't expecting what Catherine Reed was about to tell her. Catherine was thin and gray, her body consumed by cancer, but her eyes were clear and focused when Ruiz entered the room. She asked the nurse to leave, waited until the door clicked shut, and then looked at Ruiz with an expression that was equal parts relief and terror. "I need to tell you about Maria Oliveira," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you what my husband did." Ruiz felt her heart rate spike. Every detective in Fall River knew the Oliveira case. It was the one that got away, the murder that had never been solved, the family that had never gotten justice. She pulled a chair close to Catherine's bed, opened her notebook, and turned on her phone's voice recorder. "Mrs. Reed," she said carefully, "I need you to understand that anything you tell me can be used in a criminal investigation. Do you understand that?" Catherine nodded. "I understand. I've understood for 15 years, I just couldn't live with it anymore. I can't die with this inside me." What Catherine Reed described over the next hour would break the case wide open and destroy what was left of two families. She started with Thanksgiving 2008, describing the dinner at their house on Globe Street. Maria had been supposed to come but had to work. Anthony had been there with his mother and his boys. David had seemed normal, she said, charming and attentive as always, but after everyone left around 11:30 p.m., after she'd gone upstairs to bed exhausted from cooking all day, she'd heard David's truck start in the driveway. She'd looked out the window and seen him pulling out, heading somewhere at 11:45. She'd thought nothing of it at first. David often drove around late at night when he was stressed or couldn't sleep, but he'd come home at 3:15 a.m. She'd seen the time on the bedside clock when he'd climbed into bed beside her. His clothes smelled like the woods, like wet leaves and dirt. She'd asked where he'd been. He'd said he couldn't sleep and had gone for a drive. She'd accepted it. Why wouldn't she? They'd been married 23 years. She trusted him. Then the news broke about Maria's disappearance. Then her car was found. Then her body was discovered in the bioreserve. Catherine watched her husband transform during the investigation. He became helpful, almost aggressively so, volunteering information to police, organizing search parties, comforting Anthony, but in private, at home, he was different. Paranoid, checking the news obsessively, cleaning his truck multiple times even though it was already clean, burning items in their backyard fire pit, including clothes she'd seen him wear on Thanksgiving night. Catherine had confronted him 3 months after Maria's death. They'd been in the kitchen late at night, David drinking beer and staring out the window. She'd asked him directly, "Did you do something to Maria?" He'd looked at her with eyes that were cold and distant, eyes she'd never seen before in their marriage, and he'd said, "Don't ever ask me that again. Whatever you think you know, you don't. And if you love our daughter, if you want this family to survive, you'll forget you ever had that thought." It was a threat, clear and unmistakable. Catherine had lived with that threat for 15 years, watching her husband play the role of grieving brother-in-law, watching Anthony spiral into depression and the boys grow up without their mother, watching the community move on while she carried the weight of knowing. But now, dying in a hospital bed with nothing left to lose and no time left to keep quiet, she was telling the truth. David had killed Maria. She didn't know why. She didn't know how. But she knew he'd done it, and she knew where to find evidence. Ruiz left St. Anne's Hospital and drove directly to the police station. She briefed her sergeant, who immediately contacted the Bristol County District Attorney's Office. By 6 p.m., a team was assembled, detectives from Fall River, investigators from the Massachusetts State Police, a prosecutor from the DA's office. They pulled the original case file, reviewing every detail in light of Catherine's statement. David Reed had been interviewed early in the investigation, but never seriously considered as a suspect. He had an alibi supported by his wife and daughter. He had no apparent motive, and most importantly, his DNA wasn't in the system to compare against the samples recovered from under Maria's fingernails. But that was about to change. Armed with probable cause based on Catherine's deathbed statement, prosecutors obtained a search warrant for David Reed's residence and a separate warrant to compel a DNA sample. The warrants were executed at 6:15 a.m. on October 18, 2023. 20 officers surrounded the triple-decker on Globe Street. David answered the door in his bathrobe, his face going pale when he saw the assembled police. He was read his rights and taken into custody without resistance, his hands trembling as the handcuffs clicked shut. The search of the house took 8 hours. In the basement, investigators found a locked metal cabinet that David initially refused to provide keys for. They brought in a locksmith. Inside the cabinet, wrapped in plastic and hidden beneath old tax documents, they found items that made everyone in the room stop breathing. Maria's cell phone, the one that had disappeared from her car 15 years ago, her car keys, her wedding ring, a single earring, the match to the one that had been left on the dashboard of her Honda, and most damning, a spiral notebook containing handwritten entries that read like a stalker's diary. The entries in the notebook dated back to 2006, 2 years before Maria's death. They detailed her work schedule, which David had apparently tracked by calling the hospital and asking when Nurse Oliveira would be working. They described her appearance, what she wore, how she smiled. They contained fantasies, increasingly violent, about confronting her, controlling her, owning her. The final entry was dated November 27, 2008, Thanksgiving Day. It read, "Tonight, after her shift, she'll have to listen to me finally. She'll have to understand how I feel, and if she doesn't, if she tries to tell Anthony, then I'll have no choice. This ends tonight, one way or another." The DNA sample taken from David Reed was rushed to the state crime lab. The results came back 48 hours later, a perfect match to the DNA recovered from under Maria Oliveira's fingernails in 2008. The evidence was overwhelming. The physical items from Maria's car, the stalker notebook, the DNA match, Catherine's testimony, and when investigators re-interviewed David and Catherine's daughter, now 30 years old and living in Providence, she broke down and admitted she'd lied about the timeline that Thanksgiving night. Her father had asked her to tell police he'd been home all evening, and she'd been too afraid to refuse. He hadn't been home, she didn't know where he'd gone, but he'd left the house around 11:30 p.m. and hadn't returned until early morning. David Reed was formally charged with first-degree murder on October 21, 2023. The Bristol County District Attorney held a press conference, announcing the break in a case that had haunted the community for 15 years. Anthony Oliveira stood behind the prosecutor, flanked by his 2 sons, now grown men at 27 and 24. When the prosecutor finished speaking and invited Anthony to say something, he approached the microphone with the wary posture of someone who'd learned not to hope for much. "I want to thank the investigators who never forgot Maria," he said, his voice breaking. "I want to thank Mrs. Reed for having the courage to tell the truth, and I want David to know that we never stopped looking for answers. He stole my wife, my son's mother, but he didn't steal our need for justice. Today we got a little piece of that back." The trial began in March 2024. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented the physical evidence, Maria's belongings found in David's basement, items only the killer could have possessed. They presented the DNA evidence, with expert testimony, explaining the statistical impossibility that the DNA under Maria's nails belonged to anyone but David Reed. They presented the notebook, reading entries that depicted a man obsessed, unhinged, dangerous. They presented Catherine's testimony, recorded at the hospital just days before her death on November 3, 2023. She'd survived just long enough to see her husband arrested, then let go. The defense tried to argue that the evidence had been planted, that Catherine's testimony was unreliable due to the pain medication she was on, that the DNA could have been contaminated over 15 years of storage. But the jury wasn't buying it. The Commonwealth had built a case that left no reasonable doubt. After 3 weeks of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing took place on April 12, 2024. Under Massachusetts law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But before the judge pronounced that sentence, the court heard victim impact statements. Anthony spoke first, describing 15 years of sleepless nights and unanswered questions, of watching his sons grow up without their mother, of struggling to explain to them why bad things happen to good people. Michael spoke next, his voice steady despite the tears running down his face, talking about the hole in his life where his mother should have been, how he'd graduated high school and college and gotten married with her absence like a constant weight. Lucas, the younger son, spoke last, saying simply, "He stole my mom, he stole our future. And he never even said he was sorry." Then it was David Reed's turn. He stood at the defense table, looking older than his 62 years, and addressed the court. He didn't apologize, he didn't express remorse, instead he maintained his innocence, insisting that he'd been framed, that Catherine had lied, that the evidence had been manipulated. His voice grew louder, more desperate, until his own attorney put a hand on his arm to quiet him. The judge, a woman named Patricia McCarthy, who'd been on the bench for 20 years, looked at David with something approaching disgust. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you had 15 years to tell the truth. You chose to let a family suffer instead. The law provides only one sentence for your crime, and I impose it with the hope that you spend every day of your remaining life thinking about what you've done. Life in prison without the possibility of parole." David Reed was transported to MCI Cedar Junction, a maximum security prison in Walpole, Massachusetts, where he'll spend the rest of his life. The motive for Maria's murder was never fully explained. Prosecutors theorized during the trial that David had developed an obsession with his sister-in-law, that he'd made advances she'd rejected, and that he'd killed her in a rage when she threatened to tell his brother. The notebook supported this theory, but without David's confession, the full truth remained locked inside his head. For the community of Fall River, the resolution of the case brought complicated feelings: relief that justice had finally been served, anger that it had taken 15 years, sadness for the two families destroyed by one man's actions. The local newspaper ran a story about the case's resolution, noting that in a city famous for Lizzie Borden's unsolved family murder, this time the outcome was different. This time the killer was caught, tried, and convicted. This time justice, delayed but not denied, had its day. Anthony Oliveira still lives in Fall River, still in the apartment on Ferry Street where he and Maria raised their sons. He's 62 years old now, retired from his job at a manufacturing plant, spending his days between his modest apartment and the cemetery where Maria is buried. He visits her grave every Sunday after Mass at St. Anthony's Church, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the bench nearby to tell her about their sons' lives, about the grandchildren she never got to meet, about the small victories and quiet sorrows of a life lived in her absence. The silver Honda Civic is long gone, sold years ago because he couldn't bear to look at it, but he still drives past Quequechan Mill sometimes, still feels his chest tighten when he sees the parking lot where her car was found. Michael Oliveira, the older son, became a police officer. He graduated from the Massachusetts State Police Academy in 2017 and now works as a detective in the Bristol County District Attorney's Office, specializing in cold cases. His colleagues say he has a particular intensity when working cases involving missing women, a drive that goes beyond professional obligation. He's married now, with 2 daughters, and he's told his wife that he became a cop because he needed to believe that justice was possible, that closure was attainable, even when it took 15 years. He keeps a photo of his mother in his desk drawer, the same one that appeared on missing person posters throughout Fall River in 2008, and sometimes late at night when he's working a difficult case, he looks at it and remembers why he does this work. Lucas Oliveira took a different path. He left Fall River after high school, unable to live in a city where every street corner reminded him of his mother or the investigation or the years of not knowing. He moved to Portland, Oregon, as far from Massachusetts as he could get while staying in the continental United States, and built a life in tech, working for a software company, and deliberately avoiding anything connected to law enforcement or criminal justice. He doesn't talk about his mother's case much, even with his therapist, but he was there at the trial, sitting in the front row every day, watching David Reed, and trying to understand how someone could wear the mask of normalcy so completely while hiding such darkness underneath. The Oliveira case became a teaching example at the Massachusetts State Police Academy, used to illustrate several important principles of homicide investigation. First, the danger of tunnel vision in the early stages of an investigation when detectives might focus too heavily on obvious suspects like spouses while missing other possibilities. Second, the critical importance of preserving evidence even in cases that go cold, because technology advances and what's untestable today might be solvable tomorrow. Third, the value of building relationships with communities, because the break in this case came not from forensics or surveillance but from a dying woman's conscience, and she came forward only because she trusted that the police would listen. Detective Tom Santos, who worked the original investigation, died in 2021, 2 years before the case was solved. He was 73 years old, and the Maria Oliveira file was still in his home office when his family cleaned out his belongings. His daughter, who'd become a lawyer, donated all his case materials to the Fall River Police Department for their records. When Detective Angela Ruiz broke the case in 2023, she called Santos's widow to tell her. The widow cried on the phone and said Tom would have been so relieved that he'd carried that unsolved case like a weight around his neck for over a decade, that he'd always believed David Reed was involved but could never prove it. She asked Ruiz to put flowers on Maria's grave for her, from Tom. A final gesture from a detective who'd never stopped caring about a victim he couldn't save. Catherine Reed's role in the case sparked intense debate. Some viewed her as a hero who finally found the courage to tell the truth, even knowing it would destroy her family. Others condemned her for waiting 15 years, for letting Anthony and his sons suffer without answers, for prioritizing her own family's stability over justice for Maria. Legal analysts noted that Catherine herself could have been charged as an accessory after the fact, since she'd had credible suspicion of her husband's involvement and had done nothing. But prosecutors chose not to pursue charges, partly because she was dying when she came forward, and partly because without her testimony, they might never have built a case strong enough to convict David. The Reed family's triple-decker on Globe Street was sold in early 2024, shortly after David's conviction. The daughter, whose name was kept out of media reports because she was a minor at the time of the murder, moved away from Massachusetts entirely. Neighbors reported that the house sat empty for months before being purchased by a developer who planned to renovate it into rental units. There was some discussion in the community about whether the house's history would affect its value, whether future tenants deserved to know that a murderer had lived there, had kept his victims' belongings hidden in the basement. But in Fall River, where Lizzie Borden's house operates as a profitable bed and breakfast, dark history doesn't necessarily diminish property values. It sometimes enhances them. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about obsession, family dynamics, and the masks people wear. David Reed had been, by all outward appearances, a pillar of his community. He coached youth soccer, volunteered at church festivals, ran a successful small business, and maintained friendships that stretched back decades. The revelation of what he'd hidden, the stalking behavior documented in that notebook, the calculated murder and subsequent deception, shattered the community's sense that they could recognize evil when they saw it. If David Reed could hide such darkness for so long, who else might be concealing similar secrets? The paranoia was subtle but real, manifesting in increased security systems, in parents being more cautious about who they trusted with their children, in a general erosion of the small-town belief that everyone knew everyone, and that familiarity equaled safety. Forensic psychologists who examined the case noted several concerning patterns in David's behavior that, in retrospect, might have served as warning signs had anyone been paying attention. The notebook showed a progression from admiration to obsession to dehumanization, a classic trajectory seen in stalking cases that escalate to violence. David's writings about Maria moved from describing her physical appearance and personality to fantasizing about controlling her to finally referring to her as an obstacle that needed to be removed. The fact that she was family, married to his own brother, added a layer of transgression that some experts suggested heightened the psychological stakes for David. He wasn't just obsessed with a woman. He was obsessed with a woman who was supposed to be off-limits, which may have intensified both his desire and his rage when that desire was rejected. The Thanksgiving timing of the murder also struck investigators as significant. Thanksgiving is traditionally a family holiday, a time of gathering and gratitude, and David had chosen that night, that holiday, to destroy his own family and his brothers. Psychologists suggested this might indicate that his resentment wasn't just directed at Maria, but at the entire family structure, at the life his brother had that perhaps David felt he deserved. The murder wasn't just about silencing someone who might expose his obsession, it was an act of destruction aimed at the heart of family itself. The forensic evidence recovered from David's basement raised questions about how he'd managed to keep those items hidden for 15 years. The locked cabinet was in a corner of the basement that Catherine said she rarely entered, and their daughter had left for college in 2010 and only visited occasionally after that. But for David to keep physical evidence of his crime, rather than destroying it, suggested something psychological. Some experts theorized he kept the items as trophies, a common behavior among certain types of killers who derive satisfaction from possessing reminders of their victims. Others suggested it might have been more complicated, that perhaps David was unconsciously sabotaging himself, creating evidence that would eventually lead to his capture, because some part of him wanted to be caught, wanted to be punished for what he'd done. The investigation also revealed details about the actual murder that painted a harrowing picture of Maria's final minutes. Based on the forensic evidence and the timeline reconstructed from David's notebook and phone records, investigators believe the following sequence of events occurred on the night of November 27, 2008. David had left his house on Globe Street around 11:30 p.m. Shortly after his brother Anthony departed, he'd driven to a location near Charlton Memorial Hospital and waited in the parking lot for Maria's shift to end. When she left at 11:03 p.m., he'd followed her in his truck, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice but close enough to track her route. At some point, possibly near Quequechan Mill, or possibly at another location, David had forced Maria to pull over. How he accomplished this remained unclear. He may have used his truck to block her path, or he may have flagged her down, relying on the fact that she knew him and wouldn't be immediately afraid. Once she'd stopped, the confrontation had occurred. David's notebook suggested he'd intended to talk to her, to make her understand his feelings, but Maria's reaction, whatever it was, had led to violence. The defensive wounds on her body, the DNA under her fingernails, indicated she'd fought hard. The ligature marks on her neck suggested David had strangled her with something he'd brought with him, possibly a cord or wire, indicating premeditation, even if he'd convinced himself he only wanted to talk. After killing Maria, David had staged the scene at Quequechan Mill, parking her car there, arranging her belongings in a way that suggested an interrupted life. He'd kept her phone, keys, and jewelry as trophies. Then he'd driven her body to the southeastern Massachusetts bioreserve, a location he knew well from his construction work. He'd carried or dragged her body down the ravine, covered it with branches and leaves, and driven home, arriving at 3:15 a.m., the time Catherine had noted. He'd burned his clothes, cleaned his truck, and begun the performance that would last 15 years, the grieving brother-in-law who'd suffered a terrible loss alongside everyone else. The question of why David had chosen to reveal his obsession that night, that specific Thanksgiving, was never fully answered. His notebook entries suggested it was a breaking point, that he could no longer tolerate the distance between them, the fact that she saw him as nothing more than her husband's brother. Prosecutors theorized that perhaps Maria had said or done something recently that David interpreted as rejection or dismissal, something that triggered his decision to act. But without David's cooperation, without a confession that explained his thinking, the precise catalyst remained unknown. The case received significant media attention beyond Fall River. True crime podcasts covered it extensively, drawn by the elements that made it compelling: the long timeline, the family betrayal, the deathbed confession, the eventual justice. One podcast, Cold Case Files Revisited, dedicated 3 episodes to the Maria Oliveira case, interviewing former investigators, family members, and legal experts. The host noted that what made the case particularly haunting was how it subverted expectations. The killer wasn't a stranger, wasn't someone from Maria's past with an obvious grudge. He was family, someone who'd attended birthday parties and holiday dinners, someone who'd looked Maria's children in the eye while knowing what he'd done to their mother. The ethical implications of Catherine Reed's silence generated substantial discussion in legal and psychological circles. Some argued that she'd been a victim herself, living under threat from a dangerous man, and that her decision to stay silent was understandable given the context of fear and manipulation. Others countered that she'd had 15 years to come forward, that at any point she could have gone to police anonymously, that her silence had extended the Oliveira family's suffering unnecessarily. The debate highlighted larger questions about moral responsibility, about what we owe to victims of crime versus what we owe to our own families, about whether protection of one's own children justifies allowing someone else's children to suffer. Defense attorneys used the case to illustrate problems with long-delayed prosecutions. They argued that David Reed's right to a fair trial had been compromised by the passage of 15 years, that witnesses' memories had faded, that evidence had degraded, that the presumption of innocence was harder to maintain when someone had been living free for so long. But prosecutors countered that the physical evidence was solid, the DNA match was unimpeachable, and Catherine's testimony was corroborated by the items found in David's basement. The jury's quick verdict suggested they agreed with the prosecution. The case also became a focal point for discussions about the statute of limitations in criminal law. Massachusetts, like most states, has no statute of limitations for murder, meaning someone can be prosecuted decades after the crime. This case demonstrated why justice delayed is better than justice denied, and Maria Oliveira's family deserved answers and accountability regardless of how much time had passed. But the case also highlighted the challenges of such prosecutions, the difficulty of piecing together events from the distant past, the reliance on aging witnesses and degraded evidence, the question of whether punishment still serves its purposes when administered so long after the crime. For Fall River as a community, the resolution of the Maria Oliveira case was bittersweet. The city had carried this unsolved murder like a scar, a reminder that sometimes bad things happened without explanation or resolution. The news that David Reed had been arrested and convicted brought a sense of closure, but also reopened old wounds. People remembered the search efforts, the vigils, the months of fear when a killer was presumed to be at large. They remembered the impact on the Portuguese community, the way Maria's death had cast a shadow over a tight-knit immigrant population that had always looked after its own. The economic context mattered too. Fall River in 2008 was a city still struggling with the loss of its textile industry, with high unemployment and poverty rates, with the social problems that come from economic desperation. The police department was underfunded, the detective bureau understaffed. When Santos had worked the case, he'd been juggling multiple homicides and drug-related crimes, trying to give each case the attention it deserved but constrained by limited time and resources. The fact that the case went cold wasn't just about a clever criminal, it was about a system stretched too thin to catch him. When the case was finally solved in 2023, Fall River's economic situation hadn't improved much, and the police department still operated on a tight budget, a reminder that justice sometimes depends on factors beyond determination or skill. The abandoned Quequechan Mill, where Maria's car was found, remains standing as of 2024. There have been periodic discussions about demolishing it or renovating it into apartments or commercial space, but funding never materializes and the building continues to decay. Some locals avoid it, viewing it as cursed or haunted, a place where bad things happened and bad energy lingers. Others see it as a monument to a city's industrial past and believe it should be preserved. The parking lot, where Maria's Honda was discovered, has become, informally, a memorial site. People leave flowers there on the anniversary of her disappearance, small bouquets that wilt and blow away but are regularly replaced by community members who never knew Maria, but feel connected to her story. The Massachusetts State Police used the Oliveira case to advocate for increased funding for cold case investigations and for the adoption of investigative genetic genealogy techniques. They pointed out that while the case was ultimately solved through Catherine Reed's deathbed confession, it could have potentially been solved earlier through genetic genealogy, if resources had been available to pursue that avenue. The DNA recovered in 2008 was perfectly viable for genealogy analysis, and if investigators had been able to run it through genealogy databases in, say, 2020, they might have identified David Reed through family connections years before his wife came forward. This raised interesting questions about the intersection of technology, funding, and justice. How many other cold cases in Massachusetts and across the country could be solved with genetic genealogy if departments had the budget to pursue it? How many families were still waiting for answers that technology could provide? if only the resources were allocated. The Oliveira case became a rallying point for advocates of cold case units and for increased investment in forensic science infrastructure. Several Massachusetts legislators cited it when introducing bills to fund cold case investigations and to establish a state-level genetic genealogy program. The case also impacted how law enforcement approached family interviews in homicide investigations. The fact that David Reed had been interviewed early and cleared, partly based on his wife's and daughter's alibi confirmation, led to new training protocols about recognizing when family members might be lying out of fear or coercion. Detectives were taught to look for subtle signs of distress or inconsistency, to interview family members separately and multiple times, to create opportunities for people to come forward safely. The goal was to prevent another case like this, where a killer hid behind a wall of family loyalty, real or coerced, for 15 years. For students of criminal psychology, the David Reed case offered a disturbing case study in compartmentalization and the capacity for deception. How does someone kill their sister-in-law, hide the evidence, and then spend 15 years living a normal life, maintaining relationships, performing grief? The psychological mechanisms required for such sustained deception are remarkable. Reed apparently never confessed to anyone, except implicitly to his wife. He never slipped up in conversation, never got drunk and said something revealing, never exhibited obvious signs of guilt that made people suspicious. He attended Maria's funeral and wake, comforted his brother, helped raise money for the family, all while knowing exactly what had happened to her because he'd caused it. Some psychologists suggested that David may have engaged in a form of psychological splitting, where he compartmentalized his actions so thoroughly that he could genuinely experience empathy for the Oliveira family's loss while simultaneously being responsible for that loss. Others argued it was simply sociopathy, a fundamental lack of empathy, that allowed him to perform emotions he didn't feel. The fact that he maintained his innocence even after conviction, even when the evidence against him was overwhelming, suggested either delusional thinking or a commitment to the performance so deep that he couldn't step out of it even when it no longer served any purpose. The trial transcript revealed one particularly chilling exchange during David's cross-examination. The prosecutor asked him about the notebook found in his basement, about the entries detailing his obsession with Maria. David's response was to claim the notebook was planted, that police had fabricated it. When the prosecutor pointed out that the notebook contained details about Maria's schedule, an appearance that only someone watching her closely would know, details that predated her death, and thus couldn't have been fabricated after the fact, David's answer was simply, "I don't know how it got there." The prosecutor pressed, "Are you saying the police wrote a diary in your handwriting about your sister-in-law 2 years before she died?" David replied, "I'm saying I didn't write it." The exchange illustrated the depth of his denial or deception, his unwillingness to acknowledge reality, even when confronted with incontrovertible evidence. The impact on Maria's sons was profound and lifelong. Both young men had to reconcile not just with their mother's murder, but with the fact that the murderer was their uncle, someone who'd been part of their lives, who'd attended family gatherings, who'd maintained a relationship with them even while knowing what he'd done. The betrayal extended beyond Maria to them, a violation of the basic trust that family is supposed to represent. Michael, the older son, told reporters after the trial that the hardest part wasn't the verdict or the sentence, it was understanding that someone could wear a mask for so long, that they couldn't trust their own judgment about people anymore. If Uncle David could be a killer, anyone could be anything. The resolution of the case also brought a measure of peace to the nursing staff at Charlton Memorial Hospital, where Maria had worked. Many of her former colleagues had never stopped thinking about her, had attended memorials every year, had wondered if her killer would ever be caught. When news broke of David Reed's arrest, several retired nurses contacted the hospital to express relief. One wrote a letter to the editor of the Fall River Herald News saying that Maria had been the kind of nurse everyone aspired to be, patient and skilled and caring, and that it was fitting that justice had finally been served, even after so long. The hospital itself established a small memorial fund in Maria's name, providing scholarships for nursing students at Bristol Community College, ensuring that her legacy would be not just about how she died, but about how she lived, and what she contributed to her community. Anthony Oliveira, when asked by reporters how he felt after the conviction, gave an answer that was both honest and heartbreaking. He said he felt relieved that they finally knew the truth, that David would spend the rest of his life in prison, that there was a measure of justice for Maria. But he also said that nothing could bring her back, that the 15 years they'd spent not knowing couldn't be recovered, that his sons had grown up without their mother, and no verdict could change that. He said he forgave Catherine Reed for waiting so long to come forward, because she'd ultimately done the right thing, and without her testimony they might never have known the truth. But he couldn't forgive David, didn't want to forgive him, and hoped he lived a long life in prison thinking about what he'd done. As of 2024, David Reed is incarcerated at MCI Cedar Junction in Walpole, Massachusetts. He's housed in general population, working in the prison library, and maintaining his innocence in occasional letters to newspapers and legal advocacy groups. He's filed appeals claiming ineffective assistance of counsel and challenging the admission of Catherine's testimony, but legal experts give those appeals virtually no chance of success. The evidence against him was too strong, the trial too carefully conducted. He'll almost certainly die in prison, an old man who destroyed 2 families and spent his final decades behind walls. The case stands as a reminder of several uncomfortable truths about crime and justice. That sometimes killers aren't monsters, they're people who seem normal, who live among us, who hide in plain sight, that family can be the source of greatest betrayal. That justice is possible even after long delays, but the delays themselves inflict additional harm on victims' families. That the truth sometimes emerges in unexpected ways, through deathbed confessions and dying regrets, through the cracks and conspiracies of silence. And that in cities like Fall River, where history casts long shadows and old crimes echo through generations, the resolution of one case doesn't erase the others, but offers hope that someday, somehow, all the questions might be answered, and all the ghosts might rest.